So, a lot of us have done one of those DNA tests, right? You spit in a tube and you get back this neat little pie chart of your ancestry. But what if I told you that chart? It's just showing you the last page of an absolutely epic 1,000-year-long book. That's what we're getting into today. The incredible story that those tests just don't tell you. You know the drill. You open it up and it says something like, hey, you're 15% Irish, 30% Nigerian, and 20% South Asian. And it feels so concrete, doesn't it? It connects you right to these places on a map. Today, it tells you, okay, some of my ancestors came from Ireland, some from West Africa, some from South Asia. Case closed. But here's the real question, the one that changes everything. What happens if we spin that clock back, not just 500 years, but way back, like 5,000 years or even 50,000 years? What story does our DNA tell then? Because, and this is the wild part, the people who lived in those exact same places back then, they are almost never who we assume they are. And that, right there, is the catch. See, those tests you and I take, they're basically just a snapshot. They're comparing your DNA to the DNA of people living today and different parts of the world, which really only gives you a good picture of the last 500 years or so. But before that, oh man, before that, human history was this absolute whirlwind of movement and migration and mixing, and those tests just weren't built to see any of it. So, okay, how do we look deeper then? Well, the answer came from this total game changer, a scientific revolution that's basically a time machine for our genes, and that is the ability to sequence ancient DNA. And listen, the change in what we thought we knew was staggering. I mean, before 2010, all we really had were old bones and artifacts, right? And based on that, we had a pretty reasonable theory. Once people settled down somewhere, well, they mostly stayed there. But after 2010, ancient DNA just ripped the veil off. The picture wasn't stability. No way. It was a world of constant, dramatic, unbelievable motion. The geneticist David Reich has this perfect way of putting it. He says ancient DNA is like the telescope or the microscope. Think about it. Before the telescope, we had no idea other planets had moons. Before the microscope, we didn't know about bacteria. In the same way, ancient DNA is letting us see huge, fundamental things about our own past that we literally never, ever imagined were there. And the discoveries that came out were just immediately mind-bending. The first huge surprise? It turns out modern humans moving out of Africa didn't just replace groups like the Neanderthals. Nope, they met them and they mixed with them. And then, get this, scientists pulled DNA from a tiny little pinky bone found in a cave in Siberia and discovered a whole new type of ancient human we never knew existed, the Denisovans. A pattern was starting to emerge. Pretty much everything we thought we knew was wrong. So all of this just completely blew up the old models of human history. We had to basically throw out that idea of a neat, clean family tree, where the branches just split off and never touch again. The reality, oh, it's so much messier, so much more complex, and honestly, way more interesting. Yeah, for the longest time, we pictured our history like that simple family tree, you know? A group splits, the branches grow apart, end of story. But what ancient DNA is showing us is that it's more like a braided trellis or a tangled vine. Yeah, populations split apart, but then they weave back together. They mix, they merge, they separate again in this constant dance. And what that tells us is something profound. The baseline for humanity isn't purity, it's mixture. It always has been. And hey, you want a perfect example? Just look in the mirror. If your recent ancestry is from anywhere outside of Africa, then on average, about 2% of your DNA comes from Neanderthals. Think about that. That's a real, measurable piece of an ancient mixing event, right there inside you. It's one of those threads in the great human braid, connecting us directly to a totally different kind of human. Okay, to really get a handle on just how dramatic all this change and mixing really is, let's zoom in on one place where we have an unbelievable amount of high-resolution data: Great Britain. The history of this one island is just, wow. It's a story of one population almost completely replacing another over and over and over again. Okay, so here's how it went down in Britain. First, after the Ice Age, you have hunter-gatherers arrive. Then, around 6,000 years ago, a whole new group of people, farmers from what's now Turkey, show up. And they don't just mix in, they almost completely replace the original hunter-gatherer DNA. Now, these farmers and their descendants, they're the ones who built Stonehenge. But here's the kicker, just a few hundred years later, they themselves are almost totally replaced by another new wave of people arriving from the continent. Just let that sink in for a second. The people who built Stonehenge, within just a few hundred years of them finishing this incredible monument, their genetic signature is almost gone. At least 90% of the ancestry on the island was replaced by these newcomers. That's not a small change. That's a total genetic revolution. As David Reich puts it, if you're a white British person today, you're only a homeopathic dilution of those people who built one of the most famous structures on Earth.
And here's the thing, Britain is not some weird exception. In fact, you could argue that being an island actually protected it a bit from the constant churn of people you see elsewhere. This pattern of massive disruption, of huge migrations, of populations mixing and replacing each other, this is the rule for human history, not the exception. I mean, pretty much everywhere scientists have been able to look with this new tool, they find the same kind of story. You look at Europe, the genetic landscape was totally transformed by a massive migration of people from the Eurasian steppe about 5,000 years ago. You look at Africa, skeletons from Malawi show that whole populations that lived there just a few thousand years ago have, poof, vanished genetically. And maybe the most shocking one, in Spain, about 4,500 years ago, something happened that led to 100% of the local male Y chromosomes being completely replaced by those of the newcomers.
So, what does all this mean? Where does this leave us? Well, when you put all these pieces together, it leads to this really powerful and frankly unavoidable conclusion about who we are and what it means to be from a place. And this quote from David Reich just sums it up perfectly. He says, "The thing that I keep coming back to is that everybody is mixed. Nobody is pure." For a long time, the scientific assumption was the exact opposite, that populations were pure, unless you could prove they'd mixed. Well, that idea has been completely flipped on its head. The evidence is just overwhelming now. Mixture isn't the weird thing that happens sometimes, it's the baseline. It's the human story. And look, this scientific reality, it runs right up against a lot of the myths we tell ourselves about identity and nationalism. This idea of a single, pure people who have lived on one piece of land, unchanged, since the dawn of time, the genetic data just doesn't support it at all. In fact, almost everywhere we look, the data shows the complete opposite is true. But here's the important thing. Understanding that our past is this constant story of migration and mixing, it doesn't have to erase our identity. It just reframes it. It shows us that our ability to move, to adapt, to connect and merge with other groups, that's one of the fundamental things that has made us human and made us so successful as a species. That's our real shared inheritance. So we'll end on this thought. That ancestry test you took, it told you a tiny, tiny fraction of your story. But the full story, the one being written in ancient DNA, it reveals that all of us are connected in these deep, ancient, and totally unexpected ways. Our history is messy, it's complex, it's incredibly human, and it forces us to ask ourselves a really big question. If our shared story is one of constant movement and mixing, what does it truly mean to be from anywhere at all?